In this video, I'm going to talk about some of the specific threat actions that we outlined in the previous video. We'll start with malware. And so malware is defined as any malicious software, script, or code that is run on a device that alters its state or function without the owner's informed consent. So there's various types of malware. There's a virus, which is malware that infects files and spreads when those files are copied to new hosts. A remote access Trojan, or RAT, which is software that disguises itself as something normal or innocuous. For example, another application that you would find normal on your PC, for example, or it may be disguised as an image, or even another type of file, a Word document, for example. Spyware is software that's on mobile phones and PCs that performs keylogging, reading messages, emails, etc. So keylogging is where all of the times that you type into a phone or a PC will be recorded and sent to an attacker or saved by the software for later collection. A worm is malware that propagates itself through the network. And normally we get terms like worms and viruses and malware all conflated and are used as interchangeably. So it's worth remembering that they have specific definitions when we're dealing with cybersecurity. Adware is usually browser-based software that will display ads that are not part of the sites that you visit. Pop-ups being an annoying feature of this. More prevalent in days when these things weren't blocked universally by browsers and antivirus software. Scareware is malware that displays threatening messages to the user, e.g. the police have been informed about your activities on the computer. That's sometimes combined with ransomware, but it's a common tactic to try and get a victim to do take some action. It can also be scareware, the approach taken by scammers who phone you up or send text messages claiming that they have access to your computer and that if you don't pay a ransom or buy gift vouchers and cash them in for a particular address, then certain events will happen. A bot is malware that's under the control of a command and control center, a C2, that can launch attacks such as sending spam or denial of service. Bots normally attack devices like Internet of Things, and we'll cover that in another video. But again, very prevalent because security measures on Internet of Things devices was particularly lax, and it was very easy for attackers to get control of that and install bots. Ransomware is one of the most common types of malware these days, and that is software that encrypts your folders and files and then makes a demand for payment to unencrypt. Usually the payment is done in a cryptocurrency like Monero or Bitcoin. And the other thing that malware, that attackers are doing with ransomware is exfiltrating or stealing sensitive files and data and then hitting the victim with a double demand, which is getting their data back unencrypted, and if they don't make the payment, then also the data that they've stolen will be released on the internet. A crypto miner is a type of software that uses computer resources to mine cryptocurrencies. And that, in a sense, doesn't necessarily impact the victim particularly severely, except for the use of power and resources. And you notice that the hardware would become sluggish, for example. Malware evasion. So malware can be detected in a couple of different ways. One is through static analysis, and that's a process whereby the antivirus software or anti-malware software will take a hash of a program and look for the presence of text, like strings, for example, and potentially through reverse engineering look for particular code that only malware would use. So the purpose being that it's trying to identify software as being malware. Now remember, it's not good enough just to look at the names of files, because that could be anything and they could be masquerading. Quite commonly there may be approaches where malware only ever resides in memory and not on disk, for example, and that's another additional issue. But static analysis is very fast normally in terms of potentially identifying malware. Another approach is to look at dynamic or behavioral analysis of the malware. So this is looking at what normally happens on your system and then searching for anomalies. So a number of suppliers of anti-malware software are now looking at using machine learning and AI techniques for looking for anomalous behavior or behavior that's typical of malware. So malware itself usually tries to evade detection and removal by using a variety of techniques. One technique is to obfuscate code so that it can't be analyzed, and that may involve using encryption. Another approach is what's called polymorphism, which is encrypting or packing, but using different encryption and decryption techniques. Another approach still is metamorphic, where we change the actual code being used on a random basis so that there are a number of variants and it's not going to show up. It's going to change the hash potentially of the file, but also try and avoid static analysis. Over the years, malware has evolved, and starting in the early 2000s, although it predates that, with malware where some of the malware writers were really just doing it out of interest rather than necessarily out of malicious intent. But over the early period of the 2000s, worms were the prevalent type of malware. That then quickly got picked up by criminal gangs and organizations, and we started rapidly going into the monetization era between 2005 and 12, and we get a range of different and more sophisticated approaches to malware. Some of these we'll deal with in the labs, and in future videos. For example, Stuxnet was aimed not in terms of an approach for monetization, but for trying to actually damage the Iranian nuclear processing facilities and capabilities. Others are to do with spam and malvertising, and then the rise of botnets like Zeus, for example. From 2013 onwards, we saw the rise of the further rise of botnets, but really the incredible rise of ransomware, and that is the defining type of malware now that we are seeing most organizations having to deal with. Partly because it's proved very effective, hard to defend against, and very lucrative for the groups involved. So looking at some of the early malware, I Love You was a worm that used social engineering to trick the recipients, and that it persists even today. It arrived as spam email attachment and asked you to open up a document, and eventually it infected around 10% of all internet-connected Windows computers at the time. Now, obviously in 2000, there weren't as many Windows computers as there are now, but it was still a huge impact on the internet. In 2001, there was Code Red, and this was named after a flavor of Mountain Dew its discoverers were drinking at the time. Code Red used a software vulnerability called a buffer overflow in the web server of Microsoft servers to spread itself and deface websites. It was followed then by an upgraded version that installed a backdoor on the network computers, And a backdoor in this case is something that then would allow attackers to access the computer itself. So we started off with something that was reasonably innocuous in terms of just defacing a web page or a website by attacking the Microsoft web server, but then followed by more malicious activity by installing the backdoor. In fact, we've seen a recent reprise of this with an attack on Exchange servers, the email services that Microsoft provide, where the attack was simply to install a backdoor, and it was fairly indiscriminate. So backdoors were left on thousands and thousands of machines, and in fact the US law enforcement took the slightly unprecedented step of going into sites that they found with this attack and shutting down the back door, not waiting for the actual owners of the sites to do it. In 2008, we saw Conficker, which infected millions of computers worldwide, but didn't result in much damage. And we still don't know the worm's true purpose, but thousands of hosts remain infected to this day. And a Conficker scan routinely is detected as part of the internet's background radiation or background noise. As I mentioned before, Stuxnet was one of the first digital cyber weapons to target a physical system. And in this case, it was nuclear refinement centrifuges used by Iran to enrich uranium. And this really sort of started the whole process of understanding what the levels of sophistication that nation states, in this particular case, the attribution was thought to be the US and Israel, mainly because of the sophistication of the attack, but also the target itself being Iran and trying to stop their ability to process uranium. The other notable thing that we'll cover later about Stuxnet is that it infected computers that were not internet connected. It crossed an air gap, as it's called, and it did this by first infecting the laptops of engineers that worked in these facilities, and then waited until they copied files from their laptops and then essentially carried those files in on a USB to infect the computer systems within the processing plants. So it just goes to show that even when you think that you've got some sophisticated defenses, that doesn't always necessarily work. In 2017, we saw WannaCry, and that was the most widespread ransomware worm hybrid seen, demonstrated again how a lapse in patching can have dire consequences. Now, this was unusual because it relied on exploits that were stolen from the National Security Agency and then publicly released by a hacker group called the Shadow Brokers. And the attacks forced Microsoft to release specific updates for unsupported products because they were being attacked. So Windows XP, for example, Windows 95, Windows 7, those sort of products that were all being attacked. And this, again, had pretty significant consequences. The whole story of it is quite fascinating. But the key thing here was the fact that the dangers of security agency stockpiling essentially these types of exploits, and in this case, how they were actually stolen from the NSA and then released by this group, and who the group were, in fact, and why they eventually released it. So lots of theories about that, and there are various articles and books that have been written about that. The other thing about WannaCry, which was significant, was that a security researcher found a kill switch. By registering a domain that the ransomware contacted, he was able to stop the spread for a while until the attackers changed the software to ignore that kill switch. In June of 2017, we got NotPetya, which was sort of a sequel to WannaCry. But this had devastating effects. In fact, WannaCry had devastating effects as well. And this was ransomware that caused over $10 billion worth of damage. And some of the affected companies have yet to fully recover. So this was health services, other organizations which have been affected by these two attacks, but continue to be affected by other ransomware attacks. So when we think of attackers, we normally think about hackers and hacking. And the definition of hacking is this is an attempt to intentionally access or harm information assets without or exceeding authorization by circumventing or thwarting logical security mechanisms. So, any attempt to access a computer can be viewed as hacking. Interestingly, taking a URL for a website and manipulating that and then using that in your browser is still, in the court's view, a hacking process, and you could find yourself again being subjected to court proceedings for doing something which is relatively simple because you've essentially tried to circumvent a security mechanism and get an effect out of software. So even reverse engineering could be considered hacking of type, and then we get into a whole different world of argument around the legalities of that. So some example of threat actions that hackers might carry out are putting in a backdoor, brute forcing passwords, setting up command and control centers, C2s, denial of service attacks, exploiting known vulnerabilities either through software, malware, or carefully crafted requests to a web server, for example. Sniffing a network, that means recording traffic on a network and looking for passwords and other information, and then doing things like SQL injection. Now, we will be doing some of that in a lab, looking at vulnerabilities, and stress that these are all illegal activities, and you can find yourselves in having serious problems if you do this without the express permission of the person or the owner of the site or computer. So there are a number of different types of hackers. We've talked about those before, and of course there is a vector that hacking will use. So whether it's an email attack, a network attack, or even a physical attack, actually going into a facility and plugging a USB into a laptop. And part of the whole job of ethical hacking and testing the defenses of an organization may include physical attacks where you try and get access to an office, to a computer in that office, or even into a machine room or other secure location. Now, when hackers actually or attackers undertake an attack, they do so in a series of steps, and it's useful to view an attack in this way because for a number of reasons which we will go into in later, but part of it is around defense, that if you know that somebody's doing something which can be identified as the early stages of an attack, then you can potentially try and subvert that attack or head it off by knowing what they're likely to do next. So we talk about a cyber kill chain. This is from a military terminology, and it was first developed by Lockheed Martin, and you can see the reference there if you want to go into it in more detail. So this takes a series of steps. It looks as if it's all sequential, but of course it's not like that. Any of these steps, we can go back and start over again. So we're going to do some of these in loops, others we may do in a different order. But it usually starts off with reconnaissance, which is researching or identifying the targets that you want to actually attack, and also looking for potentially any modes of attack that you might think is going to be effective in that particular case. So that may be sort of identifying organizations within a certain sector, certain businesses in a particular country, for example, a range of different approaches that you can take to reconnaissance. Weaponization is preparing the attacks, the threat actions that you're going to take, and that may be developing malware, actually preparing the way that you're going to deliver that, the payload, whether it's going to be delivered as an email, a PDF, Microsoft Office files, for example. And then we proceed to the actual delivery, the transmission of the weapon to the target via email attachments, websites, USB drives, etc. We then move on to exploitation. Once delivered, the weapon's code is triggered and we exploit the vulnerable applications or systems. And the idea there is that we then gain access to the system in whatever the intended way was, whether it's reading data out of a database or actually getting onto a machine and running a remote shell. Installation is another stage that follows, that would be involved in installing backdoors onto the target system. The aim of this is to establish persistence, so the ability to come back at a later time of the attacker's choosing and potentially collect more data, or use the initial attack point to then pivot, as it's called, to other systems within a network. So pivoting is another term that is used in this particular stage. Command and control is also part of persistence. So this is where an outside server communicates with the weapons, providing hands-on keyboard access inside the target's network. So one of the ways of identifying attackers is by looking at the infrastructure that they utilize, and C2 servers, command and control, is one way. They'll use particular IP addresses, URLs, for example, and they can be used. The malware or software that you find on your system may be communicating with the C2, and you can identify the attackers or the attack type on the basis of these what are called indicators of compromise. So basically a piece of data that identifies an attack of some sort. And then of course there's the actions on the objective. So the attackers work to achieve whatever objective they had, which could include exfiltration or destruction of data, intrusion to another target. So whether the attackers were trying to steal data or just stop you from accessing the data and then demanding a ransomware, or spying or any other purpose. So the kill chain is one. There are lots of variants of this, but this is the basic principle that you have to understand. So MITRE ATT&CK is a framework which has taken the kill chain and modified it slightly. We won't go through all of these, but they extended it. And what they did was to take data from multiple different sources for attacks and then classify all of that data into the various phases of the attack. So it is based on the kill chain, but it's expanded a little bit so for the classification. And within each of these different tactics that are identified, there will be these particular techniques that are used. So MITRE defines what are called tactics, techniques, and procedures. So the tactics are the actual approach that you take to an attack. The stages, the reconnaissance, the resource development, for example, is a tactic. And then the techniques are the individual items within those different categories. So, for example, in reconnaissance, we might do scanning of a network. And so the technique would be scanning. The use of Nmap as a tool to actually do the scan is a procedure. And so the theory is that attackers develop these tactics, techniques, and procedures, again, borrowed from a military term, and that it's very expensive for attackers, once they've decided on techniques and procedures, to change them. And so the idea behind MITRE ATT&CK is that if you identify a set of techniques and procedures, you can potentially identify the group that was responsible for that attack. There's lots of problems with this theory, but that's the basic principle. And so this is a threat analysis model that you will see quite commonly used within industry, so it's worth being at least familiar with the concepts. So social attacks are one of the biggest classes of attack, and they exploit the weakest link in any cybersecurity chain, and that is people. So social attacks employ deception, manipulation, intimidation, and other techniques to exploit the human element or users of information assets. So the variety of different types of approaches that you can take in social attacks. Baiting is where you plant infected media. So you might drop a USB stick, for example, in a car park and hope that somebody's going to pick it up and insert it to see who the USB stick belongs to, and then in the process of doing that, infect the computer they've just plugged the USB into. This is why some organizations are very particular about plugging USBs into their computers. Bribery is another one, so we bribe somebody to do something. Elicitation, which is the subtle extraction of information through conversation. So that might be, going out with somebody over a drink or a social event and then just subtly asking them about their job, what they do, who they do it with, what they do, where they do it, etc., for information that you can use then for a subsequent attack or for other purposes. Extortion, which is blackmailing people, and this may be even tricking people into thinking they're being blackmailed. So a common scam is to say that sending an email where the attacker will claim that the victim's computer has been hacked and there's control of the camera, which has filmed them doing things they shouldn't be doing, and if they don't pay a ransom, then the information will be posted to the internet and sent to their friends and family. So that's a common way of extortion, and it goes all the way up to more serious types of extortion with threats of violence, etc. Forgery or counterfeiting, so fake hardware, software, documents, etc., is another type of social attack. Influence, where we leverage authority or obligation. Framing, scams, online scams or hoaxes, sort of saying that the tax office is after you for a tax liability. Unless you pay them a fine, then your details are going to be handed to the police. That's common scams. Phishing, which is one of the principal social type of attacks, and any type of ishing. There's smishing, which is via SMSs, for example. There's a video version of this as well. But essentially, phishing is where we're taking an email and using the email, masquerading it as if it was coming from a legitimate service, and then getting you to click on a link or to take some other type of action. Now, we'll go into phishing in a little bit more detail in a minute. Pretexting, that's where you invent a dialogue, have a dialogue which is invented on a particular scenario. So, phoning up a security person and saying, I've forgotten my password, can you give me access to my computer? For example, there's a way of pretexting. Propaganda and disinformation is another type of social attack. They're very active during the US elections, for example, sending out, especially on social media. And then there is spam, and we all know what spam is. So why does social engineering work? And it works incredibly effectively. And this is really based on the psychology of the situation. So most people want to be helpful. They tend to trust people and communications that come from other trusted people. So if you masquerade as a trusted party, then the communications become trusted. People are concerned that they don't want to get into trouble, and so will avoid that, so law-abiding. Sometimes they're willing to cut corners. So you phone up, as I said, and say, oh, look, I forgot my password. This is, the subject of lots of hacker movies and series where a security guard is socially engineered to doing something because the guard doesn't want to actually bother somebody else or wants to cut corners. Willing to believe in good fortune, that's the various scams that happen where you've told that you've won a prize and just click here to collect it. And so most people are gullible enough to believe that they have won $1 million. And of course, the old adage is true that if it sounds too good to be true, then it usually is too good to be true. And then finally, the fact that most people don't understand how technology works, and so it's fairly easy to confuse them by making all sorts of claims. And again, another scam was the one where people would phone you up claiming to be from a Microsoft call center, saying that you've got a virus on your computer and that if you give them access to your computer, they'll fix it for free. And that was very prevalent, still is, in fact. So phishing, mentioned before, that's sending emails or direct messages or SMS, pretending to be a trusted party and getting the target to click on a link to provide information or to download malware. So it relies on a credible email and a credible phishing site to capture credentials, and there are various types. So spear phishing is where targeted email is aimed at a specific victim and it's not just sent out to thousands of people at the same time. We sometimes know this as business email compromise, BEC, which is specific phishing related to a business. So it may be related to targeting things like, here's an invoice that you haven't paid, please pay it now, the details have changed, for example, would be a good example of business email compromise. Whale phishing is going after the high-value targets like CEOs of companies for the obvious reason that the amounts of money that potentially could be extracted are much larger. It's very much harder to do one of these attacks, and you have to be pretty familiar with the operations of the organization to be able to carry it off. So the basic premise of phishing, however, is just to send a boatload of emails that even if only a very small percentage are successful, will give you a reasonable number of usernames and passwords or financial payments. And so it's the laws of large numbers operating here that if you can send a large number of emails, then only a few of them need to work to be successful. So here's an example of an email. The type of email that we might send. Now, in one of the labs where we do a phishing campaign, I actually generated this email from that, and you can see that the email is purporting to asking you to join a GitHub group. So if you sent this to a developer, it wouldn't be that unusual. And you can see features like who it's from, which can be spoofed. And of course, if you click on that to look at the actual email address, then it's unlikely to correspond to that. It's harder to spoof the sender's email address than it is the actual name that it's associated with, which is very easy. Again, looking at who it's targeted and the subject matter, and then looking at all of the clues that might come here where things are subtly changed. But of course, the invitation button will have a link to a malicious site. So this is the site that it might take to, and of course you can make it better by giving it a name that looks very similar to GitHub. The padlock might not be quite appropriate, and you can detect whether it's a phishing email from that perspective as well. But everything else is very easy to clone, and as the person enters their username and password and signs in, you can then redirect them after capturing those details to the legitimate site, and what the user will think is that they've just made a mistake and it hasn't worked. They won't necessarily notice that the first attempt was for a different site. So it actually requires a reasonable amount of awareness to be aware of these types of attacks. Obviously, as protections have got more sophisticated, so have the attacks themselves.